Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui tēnā koutou katoa, ko Nina Hood aho. My name's Nina Hood and I'm the founder of the Education Hub, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this webinar this evening. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. The webinar will run for around about 55 minutes. And we are recording it, and the recording will be up on our website hopefully tomorrow. So if you want to rewatch it, or you want others to be able to watch it after you've seen it and enjoyed it so much, it will be available to view. And also to let you know that we will be opening up to questions this evening. We ask that you use the chat function, which is the little speech bubble down the bottom of your screen, to send in any questions that you might have. It's now my real pleasure to welcome tonight's guest, Kate Jones. Kate is a Senior Associate for Teaching and Learning at Evidence-Based Education in the UK, where she works to support their Great Teaching Toolkit, creating links between research and practice. Kate has a background as a teacher of humanities, history and politics, and she's also the author of 6 books and has more on the way, which is incredibly exciting, and hopefully this webinar tonight will make you want to rush out and buy all of them. Kate, welcome. It is so lovely to have you tonight for us and very early in the morning for you.
Yeah, well, good evening, good morning for me. I'm so excited to be connecting with teachers in New Zealand, and thank you for asking me.
Thank you. So to start off with, can you just tell us a little bit about what retrieval practice actually is and why it's so important?
Yeah, and this is a really important starting point because there's a little bit of misconceptions and confusion around retrieval practice, because research refers to retrieval practice often as the testing effect or harnessing the benefits of testing, but it is different to a test, a formal assessment or high stakes exam. Retrieval practice is the act of recalling information that's already in your long-term memory. So things that students have been taught, things that you know, and every time you retrieve that information, that memory changes so that it becomes easier to retrieve in the future. So using your memory improves your memory. Professor Robert Bjork, he says using your memory shapes your memory and it changes your memory. And that's exactly it. It's because the content that we teach students, we obviously want them, first of all, to understand with accuracy, but then it needs to transfer to long-term memory. But having information in long-term memory that you can't remember and you can't recall isn't helpful. So you want that information to be accessible. I can remember it confidently, quickly and correctly. And that doesn't always happen. And that's why we have to use retrieval practice. And you have to do the physical act of retrieval, either verbally answering a question or recalling something through conversation or writing that down. And some things are easier to remember than others because of their, there might be a novelty factor, it's very memorable. Other things could be more challenging, but through regular retrieval practice, you can make it easier to recall. So this is a challenge for us as teachers with our curriculum, where we have so much content that we have to teach to the students, but we then need to keep checking that, first of all, they've understood, and then later, can they remember? And then at a later date, can they still remember that? And even though this is low stakes, this is about quizzing and answering questions, when we do get to a high stakes formal exam, then this should help students, because when they're in an exam situation, they can remember that information. It's there for them. It's very accessible. And often they have to do an exam under time conditions. And retrieval practice also helps with the speed. You can remember things very quickly. In an exam, we don't have the luxury to go, oh, wait a minute. Oh, it'll come to me in a few minutes. It's on the tip of my tongue. You need it there and then. So retrieval practice is a really important teaching and learning strategy.
And obviously there's a whole body of research that's backing this up as well. It's not just you standing here telling us retrieval's good. There's actually a really sound body of evidence there as well.
Yeah, there's a a huge amount of research. Some of it dates back over 100 years ago, but there's more modern research that's been published. For example, and I can share the links with you for anyone who is interested. Pooja Agarwal is a cognitive scientist, and you could check out her website. It's free, retrievalpractice.org, and she's got free retrieval guides, and her research is on there, and it's all accessible. And in 2021, Pooja Agarwal and her colleagues published a review looking at retrieval practice in classroom conditions, because there was a lot of research that compared retrieval practice to other strategies like rereading, and then the retrieval group often performed better, and that was replicated many, many times, but often they were done in a laboratory in California with undergraduate university students. And that's because the classroom is quite a difficult place to conduct research. And one of my favourite books is by Graham Nuttall, with The Hidden Lives of Learners. I think he's from New Zealand.
He is.
And his work was incredible because he went into classrooms. So research is now looking at, does retrieval practice work in real life school environments? And the headline, spoiler alert, from Pooja Agarwal's paper was that there are consistent benefits to retrieval practice in the classroom. And there's been quite a few of these. There was another meta-analysis in 2021 that's, again, very, very positive. So the research, it can be overwhelming because there's so much research out there. And Robert Bjork and Elizabeth Bjork at University of California, Los Angeles, their research is available freely on their website, the Forgetting Lab. And as I said, I can send all of these links where they have shared experiments about memory and the findings. The challenge that we've got as teachers is that this research wasn't published for us specifically. And not all of us have a degree and a background in psychology and cognitive science. I don't, I'm a history teacher. And I found some of the research difficult initially to access because it was behind a paper wall, or I didn't have a login for an account, but that's got much easier. And then even when I did access the research, some of it was difficult to understand and there was a lot of jargon. But the way I got around that, I was very lucky because I've authored 4 books about retrieval practice. I've contacted the researchers directly and asked them, well, what do you mean by this? And what does this look like in the classroom? And the research is only sort of half of that story for us, because we then have to apply that in the classroom. And as I mentioned to you, Nina, the reason that I do talk and write about retrieval practice is because this is a strategy that I really fully embraced in 2015. And after using it for 2 years with 2 of my classes, when they did their final exams, their results were absolutely incredible. There were students achieving fantastic results in my subject, but sadly, they didn't get those grades in the other subjects because they thought retrieval practice was a history strategy. And this was not something that was happening across the whole school. My colleagues weren't all aware of it. It was just something that I was doing in my classroom. So then all of a sudden I became the golden girl. What's the secret to these fantastic exam results? And it wasn't a secret, but it wasn't common practice. So I started sharing in my school, outside of my school, on Twitter, and then lots of other people have found the same. So my passion comes probably more from my experience that actually I've seen this strategy works and it can be effective. And it led to great results, but also the students were very confident. They were ready for their exams. They felt knowledgeable. And that's just something that every teacher should have in their classroom.
Yeah, that's amazing. So then if we sort of build on your own experience, what are the sorts of things that teachers can be doing in the classroom? Do they look the same across different year levels, across different subject areas? What are some of those sort of more tangible things?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to this, and I'll go back to the research. In 2013, Professor John Dunlosky published an evidence review. This is also free to access online, Strengthening the Student Toolbox. And he looked at 10 study strategies, and through the evidence available, he was able to rank them in order of effectiveness. And the 2 most effective strategies were retrieval practice and space practice. Now, space practice refers to when you study. So you could technically cram retrieval. If you were preparing for a test, but you quizzed yourself the day before, the quizzing is the retrieval, but you're cramming. Spacing is distributed practice, where you do a little and often, and you spread that out over time. So the research has shown if students had 5 hours to revise, they'd be better spending that 5 hours across 5 days rather than 5 hours intensely in one day. So space practice, retrieval practice came out on top. Other strategies that were deemed promising but didn't have the same research to support it were interleaving and elaboration, interrogation. And then strategies that were classed as least effective, but they will work, but they require a lot more effort and energy from students and time, rereading, highlighting, underlining. And unfortunately, they're the most popular strategies. Students get the highlighters, they highlight their notes, they look brilliant, their notes, but that's a poor proxy for learning. Just because you've highlighted something doesn't mean you know it. So again, the researchers showed that, and then that research was also replicated in 2021. John Hattie did a meta-analysis asking the same question. Would we have the same results as John Dunlosky did in 2013? We've got new evidence available. And the new evidence also signposted, yes, retrieval practice is effective. And what Dunlosky argued, that it's effective for learners of all ages and across all subjects. So the research is very positive. However, when we actually look into schools and the differences across subjects and ages, that's where there is nuance. I mean, there are some things that all teachers of all subjects can do. For example, multiple choice questioning and quizzing, they're common practice. But if you teach younger children, you'll do more verbal recall because they haven't got the skills yet to read and the questions and answer them. But then also if you're practical teachers, so for example, something like physical education, so you're doing, sporty lessons outside where it's just not practical to get the mini whiteboards and start asking quizzes, but you can ask verbal questions. So the answer is yes, it works for all subjects and all ages. I'm very, very confident of that. But then once we understand retrieval practice, we have to ask, well, what does it look like in my subject and with my students? When I embraced retrieval practice, most of the research was about retrieval practice in maths and science. And I'm a history teacher. So I had to then take that and apply it to my context. Something else that I would say, I wrote my most recent book is Retrieval Practice Primary for younger students. Because I'm a secondary-based teacher and work with students 11 to 18, I tended initially to focus retrieval practice with the older students because I saw it as really a way to help them do well in their exams. But I did realize actually younger students benefit from this, and I should be using this regularly with them. And then also the same with younger, even still in primary. But the question is how do we do that? Do we do it the same way? And the research shows that we shouldn't really do it exactly the same way. So Jeffrey Karpicki has carried out a lot of research about retrieval practice. And again, he was part of the studies that compared rereading, retrieval practice showed to be more beneficial. But again, these were with university college students, and he asked the question, what about elementary, as a primary age, younger? If I replicate those experiments, will we have the same results? And he did this in 2016. And actually, what the research showed is that younger children struggled initially with retrieval practice. They weren't always sure what to write. Their answers were generalized, vague, and not always relevant. So we weren't seeing the same benefits. Now, what they would mainly be doing with older students is what we call free recall. Free recall is where you ask a question and there's no support or help at all. So if I ask my students, you write down what you can remember about the causes of World War I, go. And they just have to write it down purely from memory. That is challenging, and it's free recall, it's very effective. Now, if I ask younger children, they could really struggle with that, even if they'd been learning about that topic. So what the research showed was that students benefit from cued recall. And this is where they have more guided retrieval. So for example, I could change my question slightly. Can you explain how the alliances caused World War I? So that's a bit more specific. Or I could give them some prompts. I say, can you write about the causes of World War I? And here's some pictures on the board to remind you or help you. Or here's some keywords. Or I give them some verbal prompts. And those cues are really important. And other research studies have also argued the same, that cued recall is effective for younger students. And I would even use this in secondary with students up to about the age of 13, 14. And what the goal is to eventually remove those cues so that we do the retrieval tasks where they have some prompts and hints, and then they have the retrieval success and they can remember things and they have lots of practice. But then eventually I'll ask that question, what can you remember about the causes of World War I? And because they've completed all these retrieval tasks prior, they're able to do that. So, and this is where we're going wrong in the UK with retrieval practice, not everywhere, but the UK are doing amazing work. It's in government policy. It's compulsory for all trainee teachers to know. If you're new to the profession, you will get training on retrieval practice and cognitive science. The inspectorate, Ofsted, who inspect schools, know all about cognitive science, and they expect schools to be using retrieval practice. So the fact that there's all those things that are very, very positive, and we're going in the right direction. The problem is we may have a school leader who says, right, every teacher do 10 minutes retrieval practice at the start of your lesson. And that's because they want to promote consistency, but actually you need to take into consideration the differences across different subjects. So I'll give you an example. I went to visit a school and the department who teach food, nutrition, food and technology, cooking, said, we hate retrieval practice. I said, well, why? He said, well, we have to do it. It's non-negotiable, it's compulsory. And that 10 minutes at the start of a lesson, when we have a 55-minute lesson, means sometimes we don't have time to do the practical cooking because they're so short of time in the lesson. And that 10 minutes really interrupts that and puts it behind. So sometimes they said, right, well, we can't do that today. We'll have to do something else. I said, well, why don't you do retrieval practice when the students are waiting for their food to be cooked in the oven? They've done the prep, it's now cooking. And they said, well, yeah, exactly. Why aren't we doing that? And I asked the senior leadership team that, why? Why don't you sort of have trust and respect for the teachers, for them to use their professional judgment? And Baruch Rosenshine does suggest starting a lesson. If you're not familiar with Rosenshine's principles, they're very helpful. Again, his summary is free to read and access. And he suggests starting a lesson with regular review and revisiting prior learning. But I haven't specifically encountered research that says it's more effective at the start of a lesson. Pooja Agarwal, I asked her this question, and she said, just do it. Just do retrieval practice when you can. If you need to come in and say, right, class, we need to finish this off from last lesson, let's do that right now. Now let's do some retrieval practice and go into the new topic, then that's fine. And retrieval practice is so effective. If you're only using it for 5 or 10 minutes at the start of a lesson, you're not really getting all the benefits. You can use it throughout a lesson. You could use homework for retrieval practice as well. You could set quizzes or ask students to create flashcards. But I've just published an ebook with evidence-based education that I can send to you, and it's called Retrieval Practice: The Myths, the Mutations and the Mistakes. So although it is a very beneficial teacher and learning strategy, it does depend on how you're using it and the application.
And Kate, is there any research that tells us sort of how many times students need to be retrieving particular pieces of information? Do we want them to be doing that in the same way, in different ways? Do we know about sort of how teachers can think about that side of things?
Yeah, well, there's a few questions like that evidence can't fully answer. So the question is, how much retrieval? And the other question is, how long should I wait between teaching new content and retrieval practice, and how often? And there is guidance from the research. However, I always say it's up for teachers to decide that, because the variables include the complexity of a topic. Does it link with things that students already know? There's also things that research doesn't often take into account, such as your timetable and the logistics of when you see your class. Because I had two what we call year 9 classes, and I would see one class on a Monday, one class on a Friday, and I saw the other class last thing Monday, first thing Tuesday. So these things affect the timing of when I do the quiz. And some subjects see their students, perhaps they have 4 lessons a week. There's other subjects that sometimes only see them once a week. So all of those factors play into when you do the retrieval practice. But the key thing is that you ask questions during the encoding stage. So for anyone who's not familiar with the term encoding refers to the transfer of information from working memory to long-term memory. And another mistake that you could potentially make is to rush that stage of learning and not check for accuracy, not check for 100% understanding. And then you later do a quiz and students can't remember. Now, there's a few reasons for this, but one of them could be that they never understood it or grasped it in the first place. And you can't retrieve something from long-term memory if it doesn't get to your long-term memory. Another reason why students might forget, so if you go away and you're using retrieval practice and you say, well, my students are still forgetting and I checked very thoroughly. Well, there's something else that's called retrieval strength. And this is really important for teachers to know. And this is based on the work of Robert and Elizabeth Bjork at UCLA. And in 1992, they published a paper called The New Theory of Disuse. And this challenged a previous study called The Theory of Disuse. And that was in 1914, Edward Thorndike, leading expert at the time, claimed that if something goes to your long-term memory, but you don't use it, you lose it. And memories decay and they disappear. And people accepted that because they thought, that makes sense. That sounds right. But actually, the Bjorks were able to show, no, that's not what we found through our evidence. There's actually 2 measures of memory, storage strength and retrieval strength. And they argue that if something transfers to your long-term memory, it will always remain in long-term memory. It will always be there. And that's called storage strength. And storage strength doesn't decline. Now, the only way storage strength could be affected is through if there was an extreme accident or you had a brain injury that could lead to memory loss. Or there's also research about illnesses that also include memory loss, dementia and Alzheimer's. But that is different. So in the context of our students, if we teach something thoroughly, they have encoded it, it's gone to their long-term memory, it will always be there. But why can't they remember it if it's in their long-term memory? That's because retrieval strength fluctuates. If your students remember something quickly, confidently, correctly, their retrieval strength is high. That means it's very accessible. They know it instantly and immediately, and they know that it's correct. If they're struggling to remember and it's very slow and difficult, it might come to them eventually, or they might go, no, I can't remember. Then we shouldn't assume that we have to teach it again. What's probably more likely is their retrieval strength is low. Now, not to panic, because you can increase retrieval strength. And the way that you do that is retrieval practice. So every time you recall something from memory, you're improving your memory, you're increasing the retrieval strength. But what's key to this is the feedback. If you do a quiz with students, they're more interested in their score and the number. I've got 20 out of 25. Oh, I'm happy with that score. Well, actually, what I need you to do is look at the 5 that you didn't get right and make a note of that, engage with that feedback, so that actually when I quiz you again, you won't make that same mistake. And therefore you will improve and your memory will improve and you'll have the opportunity to retrieve it. So as you can see, there's lots of research out there. And then all of this understanding helps us a lot. Another thing about retrieval strength is if you were to quiz your students after a break in learning, let's just say they've had a holiday. We had this in the UK. I was doing a training session in January after the Christmas holidays, and the teachers were going back to school the following day. And I said, don't do a quiz tomorrow with your classes. And they said, why? Why can't we do retrieval practice? Their questions were all about last term. What do you remember before the holidays? I said, yeah, but they've had 2 to 3 weeks off. And let's assume they didn't study every single day. So what's happened is their retrieval strength has now dropped. And if you do a quiz when retrieval strength is low, then they will struggle. It will be difficult. If they don't do well, that can knock their confidence, motivation, morale, and the teacher will panic. They've forgotten everything I've taught. I have to teach it again. So actually, well, I wrote an article with Robert Bjork and Dylan William about this. And we suggest when retrieval strength is low, do a refresher, do a reminder first. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you've had a lovely holiday. Now we're probably feeling a little bit rusty. So here's a video clip to remind you, because I'll quiz you next lesson. Or you could set a homework saying, I'm not doing a quiz today. We're going to go straight into this new content. But your homework is to remind yourself of this content because I will quiz you on this next week. And that reminder, that refresher will just give them a boost, and then they're more likely to have retrieval success.
So much valuable information in here. Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone watching tonight, please feel free to send in questions and I will feed those into the conversation with Kate. Kate, one of the things that interests me, I think about a lot with retrieval practice, is that at times I see it being used just for really kind of low level fact, never, not ever moving students on beyond the sort of, here we go, let's learn this. But my reading of some of the literature would suggest that actually one of the reasons why even some of that sort of basic factual content recall is so important is that then really consolidates that memory, it strengthens the retrieval pathway so that then students can utilize that information in higher order thinking tasks. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and you are absolutely right. Retrieval practice has got a bit of a bad rep, that it's about regurgitating what we call in the UK pub quiz trivia and random facts, and absolutely not. But factual recall is a great starting point, and that's where multiple choice questions are very good. Multiple choice are great because you can ask a large amount of questions very quickly. I could ask my class 25 multiple choice questions, and because they just select the answer, they could complete that perhaps in 5 minutes. If I ask them to write it down, then we're looking at spending a lot of time. And multiple choice, you can self-assess, so the teacher can say, here's the answers, they put a tick or a cross. Dylan Williams said the best person to mark a quiz is the person who's just taken it, So we should use self-assessment with retrieval. It also helps at low stakes. But there are limitations to multiple choice. It doesn't allow for explanation and elaboration. So yes, multiple choice is great, but we can't only rely on multiple choice. And that's where we do need to go beyond that. And Pooja Agarwal's also written about higher order thinking questions. And I've got a resource, and all my resources are online. And if you are on Twitter, I'm on Twitter at @KateJones_teach. And I tend to share a resource on there. And then teachers say, oh, I've adapted it. And they usually make it even better. And one of those is called a retrieval pyramid. And it focuses on exactly that, from starting off with the questions at the bottom, which are 1 point if you want to have points. And they're these factual recall questions that are essential. You've got to know this. So the example I made was a drama example about a play we study here called Blood Brothers. And you need to know the name of the characters, where it was set, all that sort of stuff. And then the questions can gradually increase in the level of challenge. But what I do with that is I scaffold my questions so that each question actually will help the student when they get to the top of the pyramid and there's more of a complex question. So the top of my pyramid for that example, it says, can you explain how the play Blood Brothers illustrates the issue of social class? Now, there's a lot that students have to be able to know and retrieve. The theme of social class, examples of it, and be able to tackle that question. But the other questions below it have talked about different characters and their backgrounds, about violence, about money, and all of these things that then feed into that higher order question. So higher order thinking is the goal, really, but we do have to start off with this foundational knowledge. We can't skip those elements, but that's where we'll have extended writing, elaboration, verbal discussion. Another great way to do that is to provide a statement instead of a question, because a question often has, this is the correct answer, this is incorrect. But if I give my students a statement, so in history, I could say the main cause of World War I was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Discuss. And they could either respond to that through writing or discuss it with a partner. Now, they've got to have knowledge of all the causes, and they can have arguments that support that statement, arguments that challenge it. I saw an example in a primary school, so younger children, where they said, in his books, Roald Dahl presents characters as children as innocent and kind. Discuss. And it was great because the students were saying, oh yes, Matilda, she's a child, she's innocent and kind. And they talked about Matilda. Charlie from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And then the student went, wait a minute, what about Veruca Salt? She is selfish, she is spoiled. Now, all of those things, we open up the floor then for debate, discussion. But in order to have that debate and discussion, you've got to have the knowledge and you've got to retrieve it. Arthur Melton in the 60s designed a model called the learning process. And you have 3 stages: encoding, teach new content; storage, where your information is stored in your long-term memory; and then retrieval, where you retrieve that. I updated his model and added 2 other factors, because once you can retrieve information, that's great, but that's not enough. If my students can regurgitate key dates and facts in history, well, that's very useful, but I need you to apply that knowledge. I need you to be able to answer an exam question, analyze a source, write an essay. So I updated the model and I added application and transfer. And some teachers will say, well, my subject isn't about just remembering facts, it's the application of knowledge. I think all subjects are about the application, but you can only apply knowledge when you have it. And you only know you have the knowledge through retrieval practice. And then also another benefit of retrieval practice is it helps with the transfer of knowledge. And if you think about vocabulary, And this is another thing I say when teachers say, is retrieval practice relevant in my subject? I ask, do you have any subject-specific vocabulary? And they say, yes, of course. I say, well, there you go. You can use retrieval practice to help with vocabulary, with the definitions, with the spellings. But that's not enough. Students then have to transfer that and be able to use it. If you think about languages, well, if I'm learning French, if I've got all this vocabulary I know, great, but I need to use it in a sentence. I need to be able to pronounce it. I need my retrieval strength to be high. So when I go to France and I order my meal, I'm not going, I can remember it and it's all there. And I can put all of this knowledge and vocabulary together. So there's absolutely so much potential to go beyond factual recall, but we just have to design our tasks to allow that.
Yeah. Brilliant. And we've had a few questions come in, so I'll start to feed them in. We had one about varying the diet beyond just quizzes. I think you've started to touch on that, which is brilliant, sort of given some ideas of how you can think beyond just the quiz. I don't know if there's more that you want to say to that. And we've also had a question around the potential use of digital platforms to support retrieval practice.
Yeah, my first retrieval book was all about all these ideas and how it is a lot more than a quiz. There's one activity that I used in my classes. It's called Cops and Robbers, but with older students, I don't call it that because it's probably too young for them. But all you need is pen and paper. And I would draw a line down the middle of the page. And the first column, the cop column, is what can you remember about this topic? And you've got 5 minutes to retrieve. And the second column is now, can you go and collect additional information from your partner and your peers? Write things down that you didn't have, or that you forgot, or you didn't have time. And that's great because it allows students to collaborate, learn from each other, but it avoids the mistake of asking students to retrieve together. Because when we say, right, let's do a pair activity, a group activity, we could be in a pair, the teacher asks a question, I don't know it, but you know it, but we both get the point. And the teacher might assume, oh, Kate knew that as well, well done. No, I didn't. And also, maybe I do know it, but you retrieved it quicker than I did. So you've got the benefit of your retrieval strength has increased, and I haven't. So retrieval always has to be individual, but you can have the collaboration afterwards. I'm a huge fan of technology for retrieval practice because there's some great quizzes that teachers have already made and shared and make them publicly available, and that helps with workload. And technology can mark it for you so that the students get immediate feedback. And there is a debate and discussion about feedback. Should we give it immediately? Should we delay it? Well, it just depends. If I'm collecting 30 books and I need to give feedback on a written piece of work, I can't do that immediately because I've got my class waiting outside. So sometimes feedback just has to be delayed for logistical workload reasons. But with retrieval practice, we can almost always, perhaps not with extended tasks, but we can most of the time give this immediate feedback. And another activity I do is a retrieval reflection ticket, where I've done this online or on a piece of paper or at the back of their book. I make students make a note of the questions they answered correctly, but also where the gaps in their knowledge are, so that they're aware, and that helps me. It gives me a bit of insight. Okay, this is where my class is struggling. This is where they can't remember. I need to make sure I quiz them on this again. But older students can also do something about that. Okay, I don't know this, so I'll go home and I'll spend some time on it. And the research has shown, and there's a paper in 2011 by Henry Roy Digger, Megan Sumaraki, and Adam Putnam, and it's the 10 benefits of the testing effect. So 10 benefits of retrieval. It helps with the recall of information, but also helps with organisation, transfer of knowledge. Pooja Agarwal's built on this, because there is research that shows regular retrieval practice leads to an increase in student confidence and a decrease in student anxiety when it comes to exams. So it's also pastoral, not just academic. Another benefit that was in that paper was that regular retrieval practice in the classroom can lead to better study habits outside of the classroom. So if students see, oh, retrieval practice is working, this is helping me, my memory's getting better, then they can quiz themselves and test themselves at home. In terms of online quizzes, you may be familiar with these. There's Kahoot, there's Quizzes, Quiz, and then izz.com. If you don't have technology, there's Plickers, there's mentimeter.com. That's anonymous quizzing, but it still gives the teacher a snapshot of their answers. And even though it's anonymous, that can help some students. They could just relax. If I get the question wrong, then it's not a problem. And if I do a Q&A with the audience and I want them to answer a question, I use Mentimeter, because the fact that it's anonymous, more people engage. If I said, here's a question, do you know what encoding means? Write it in the chat box. And because it's got their name there, they might think, yeah, I'm not going to write it because I'm not sure. And if I've got it wrong, I don't want people to know that. But when they're writing it anonymously, they'll think, yeah, I think I know that. I'll write this down. So Mentimeter is helpful. And there's also carousel learning. This was originally created by a science teacher in the UK, Adam Boxer, and he designed retrieval roulette. So he kept going back and asking questions and revisiting them. And then it got upgraded to this website software, and it's really popular in the UK right now. Anki, A-N-K-I, is a flashcard app, which has an algorithm that helps with space practice as well. So if students get a question wrong, it makes a note of it, and it makes sure it reminds them of that again, and it spaces out the questions. So technology really can help us with this.
Brilliant. We've got some really interesting questions coming in. Just had one pop up around, so in a lot of New Zealand classrooms, you would see a strong focus on student agency, students determining their own pathways, project work. Are there ways that retrieval practice can be adopted into these particular classroom practices or not?
Yeah, so when you say student agency, is that independence and things like that?
So that's what I'm going to intuit from the question. Heidi, don't know if you want to add any more details in there. Yes, There you go.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I'll tell you what I did in terms of student agency, independence, and so on. That class that I had for 2 years that had the great results, students were using flashcards to revise. Now, they weren't using flashcards correctly. They were writing information from the textbook on a flashcard and then rereading their flashcards. So I told them, nope, that's not how flashcards work. You have one question, one answer, a keyword and a definition. Now, the reason I always say one is so that you can easily put them into piles, correct, incorrect. If you've got 5 questions and they got 3 right, 2 wrong, they'll go, oh, well, that has to be in the correct pile, but there's still 2 questions wrong that we need to tackle. So I modeled to my class what a good flashcard looks like. And then, so the way our academic year worked, we started in September, and for 2 years, they were making the flashcards every week for homework. So they would make 5 or 6 flashcards that week linked to what I'd been teaching them. Now, that's not retrieval practice, because they'd look at their notes and they'd have to come up with questions and write the answer. And I would also oversee and check them. So when they were working, I'd say, leave your flashcards on your desk, I'll quickly check. I need to check that their answers are correct, that the questions are relevant, that they're the right level of challenge, and so on. And this then really did get them into good study habits. They didn't do this with their other subjects. So 2 months before they come to their exam, they're trying to make flashcards for 10 other subjects and all these other topics. And there's too much, it's a workload issue. And because they're making flashcards right towards the end, they can't use it for regular spaced retrieval practice. So we absolutely can promote student independence and autonomy and student agency by showing them how to use retrieval practice and then encourage them to use that outside of the classroom. And using it outside of the classroom will ultimately benefit them back in the classroom as well. And there was something else about peer collaboration and so on. They can use flashcards to quiz each other, or family members can. And even if a family member say, oh, I don't know anything about this topic, you don't need to. The answer's on the flashcard. Or here's a quiz that I used with my class. I'll send it to parents. And the quiz has got all the answers. And the parents, if they want to help, and the carers can ask these questions. That's the holy grail of retrieval practice, is students embracing it and using it independently. And we need to talk to students, tell them why we use retrieval practice and how it can help them. Because otherwise they may think, oh, why is Miss testing us again? Another test, another quiz. But actually, if they realise this works, this is about improving my memory, therefore making me a better learner, then that's a game changer.
And we've had another question come in around, particularly, I think, when you're in secondary school and towards the end of the senior secondary school years, there's always this tension between coverage and just having to get through the content and covering it all, but then also building in opportunities for retrieval practice. How should teachers be thinking about that balance?
That is really tough, and that is something that I experienced. A few things there to think about is your curriculum design. I would finish the course content later than normal. What I was in the habit, and my colleagues of doing, was getting through all the content and then finish with some time to study at the end. And that is basically promoting cramming, which isn't effective. So instead I finished later, but I did regular retrieval practice. Now, when there is so much content, that's when we really got to make use of homework. And some teachers say, I don't want to do homework retrieval tasks. How do I know that the students are doing it from memory? They could be checking their phones, and there is that trust element. Oh, but the teacher may want to oversee the retrieval. So I'd say, well, why don't you do the homework where they consolidate, where they have to do the pre-reading or the making the notes, and then you've got more time in the lesson for retrieval practice. But multiple choice questions is another way of helping with that, because you can ask a lot of questions very, very quickly. So you can have 5 minutes in your lessons. Here we go. Here's a retrieval quiz, and you build that in. Now, what I did was once every half term or 6 weeks, I would have a retrieve and reflect lesson. Half the lesson, it was retrieval practice, where they were doing the elaboration, the higher order thinking, writing answers. And the second half of the lesson was whole class feedback, and they were self-assessing, checking and correcting. And that was really helpful for me. It helped my future planning, but it was also helpful for the students to have that time to retrieve, see what they could remember and what they couldn't remember. It is a challenge, but it is possible. And it is about sort of trial and error, making sure you do finish the course, but it's not a case of rushing to finish and then let's revise. But I remember that a student said to me, Miss, when are we starting to study in history? We're revising in all our other subjects. I said, how dare you? We've been studying for 2 years because we regularly retrieve and revise and go over this. So actually, just before your exam, you won't need to do all that panic studying because it's cemented and it's there. But also just I had to reflect on my lessons and get rid of things that were not a good use of time, be very efficient, and just focus the quizzes on the essential content. All of those things, but it is possible, but it's not easy.
We've had quite a few questions coming in about using retrieval practice with neurodivergent children with additional needs. Is there any research on that? Any pointers from you on that?
Yeah, there is research, but there needs to be a lot more. And there was a research paper in 2020 about students with ADHD, and it said that students did benefit from retrieval practice. There's been research about students with dyslexia. Again, students benefit. But I reached out to experts in this field of students with learning difficulties and challenges. And the main feedback that came back to me was that they can still find retrieval very stressful. So we've got to communicate, this is not a test, this is a quiz, this is to help, or an activity. Other things that we can do is not have question timers. So sometimes on Kahoot, you'll have 20 seconds to answer a question. Well, that causes panic and pressure. Also, some students need longer to read the question and process what it's asking, and they may need longer to retrieve it as well. Also need to be very careful about the language that we use and avoid leaderboards. Also, in terms of feedback, the teacher feedback or self-assessment, because they may not want their peer to know their score, because that again might cause them some anxiety. And what does help students is the cued recall, giving them prompts. If you've got a class where everybody does seem to be coping fine, but one student is really struggling, you could just give them a verbal prompt, a hint, just something to get them on the right lines. Also, visual images can help trigger memories as well. There's something called the encoding specificity principle, which suggests if we use the same cues in the encoding and retrieval stage, students are more likely to be successful. So if I had a diagram on the board and it was of the water cycle, and I'm teaching this for the very first time, it's brand new to my students, here's the diagram, I'll explain, talk it through, we'll watch a video, we'll complete a worksheet. Now later, I want to ask, what can you remember about the water cycle? But I've got some students in the class who might struggle. So I'll say, what can you remember about the water cycle? You're not allowed to look at your notes. There's no information, but I will put a picture up on the board to help you. And that picture is the exact same picture that I used when I taught about the water cycle. And the principle suggests that because it's the same, it will trigger their memory. And they'll go, oh, I remember that picture. I remember what Miss Jones told me. I remember she said this and she said that, and so on. So it's all about helping them to have that initial retrieval success with a low stakes nature and providing cues. And one other thing is also make sure we have opportunities for verbal retrieval practice in every subject. It isn't just PE and younger children and drama, even in history, because I've had students who really struggle to write down what they can remember, but verbally, they're brilliant. Verbally, they can tell me and they can really show off all their knowledge. Now, I know I have to help improve their writing, but just giving them the opportunity to retrieve it verbally helps me, because I think, okay, they do know this, they understand it, they can recall it, great. But it's great for them because it boosts their confidence. I do know this because I can tell you, I know I've got to now try and get this on paper. That's my goal. So the problem isn't the retrieval. The problem is I struggle with my literacy skills.
Okay, we're very quickly coming to the end of our time, and I feel like we've just scratching the surface and we could just do so much more. Everyone's going to have to just buy your book so that they can find out more. Just one more question about the research. So obviously there's research showing that retrieval is incredibly beneficial when students are at school, when they're preparing for exams. Do we know about sort of longer term effects that go beyond just that year or just that couple of years that they're learning in that subject? Does it extend sort of over multiple years?
Yeah, well, that's the whole concept with the storage strength and the retrieval strength, is that you can learn something, and the thing that will stop you always remembering it is that the retrieval strength will drop. Yeah. But in the UK, there's a famous battle in history, the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And a lot happened in that year, and everybody studies that in school. And a few years ago, a bank company gave some advice, and they said, please don't use your PIN number as 1066 because it's the most common PIN number that people have for the ATM. And that's because obviously that is a key date that people remember from school, and that has stuck with them for forever. And some things do get ingrained, like times table, multiplication, key dates, because they're so regularly retrieved that actually I haven't studied 1066 for 20 years, but I remember that date. Why is that? And it's because the retrieval strength is still so high.
Yeah.
And that's what we got to say to students as well, that if you do a really great job here in school, you will then remember this later on in your life.
It's
And
true.
if we
I can still decline nouns in Latin and no use for that ever, but it's still there.
It's still there because that retrieval practice, you must have had to recall it. And also, if we teach them the strategies from a young age, as soon as possible, then they just see that as a norm, and that's their study strategy, a learning habit. I have to work with older students who are 18, who are still highlighting and me reading, and I have to say, no, use retrieval practice. And it's really tough with them. They reject it and they say, well, I've always done it this way. And even we might have studied using ineffective strategies and we might have done really well, but we had to spend a huge amount of time and effort and it was stressful. So if we can equip the students with the knowledge of how to learn, that you can apply that the rest of your life in any scenario, situation. I've got a new job and I need to learn the new, the protocol here for this company. Well, I use retrieval practice. I did that in school. It helped me. Yeah, I can quiz myself on this content and then I can apply that in my workplace. So it is great in school, but it does have this potential for lifelong learning.
Amazing. Well, on that fabulous message, because I think, that's so important that it's not just a school thing, it's a lifelong thing. Kate, thank you. It's been wonderful. I know that everyone watching this evening has thought it's been fantastic. You've given such a lovely balance between the research and the theory side and how it applies in the classroom. And, for all the teachers watching, having that really practical component is just so valuable. So thank you. It's been amazing. It's just been an absolute delight to be able to host you. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, everyone. The lovely comments, and thank you, Nina, for hosting.
Thank you. And we'll let you get on to your day. And everyone else, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope that you've enjoyed it. Good night.